Good evening, everyone. Tonight's lecture is actually the Treseder Fellowship lecture. And the Treseder Fellowship was established about 3 years ago as part of a grant or a gift, effectively, of $1 million to this faculty. In order to establish a fellowship to bring out really preeminent designers, thinkers of design, people related to the design industries, to really both help this faculty and the various disciplines that are engaged here, but also the larger community as a whole in terms of the University of Melbourne, but also Melbourne itself and Victoria. And this has made an incredible difference for us, and we hope it's something that will continue to make a profound difference by bringing in experts from around the world to share with us both their experiences and their insights, but also to help Melbourne and Victoria really consolidate itself as a city and as a state of design and as a city of culture and civic awareness. And so it's very much my pleasure to thank both Robert Treseder, who's here, and Daryl LeGroux, who helped set this up through Creative Futures, and to bring that gift to the university and to this faculty. To provide a more formal introduction to this evening and to Christian Bason, I'd like to welcome to the stage Andrew Abbott, who is the creative executive with Creative Victoria through the state government of Victoria, and Creative Victoria is really the primary partner and directive for the Melbourne Design Week. Andrew.
Yeah, thank you, John. I too would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the people of the Kulin Nation. Design and design thinking been part of this land for tens of thousands of years, and I pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging from across the community who have joined us here tonight. It's wonderful to see a great turnout tonight for this event, which will explore the role design plays in business and in society more broadly, now and in the future. Creative Victoria is charged with supporting and strengthening the design industry in Victoria and with shining a light on the many benefits of design. There's no doubt that design is a major industry sector for the state. Victoria's design industry generates more than $5 billion per annum for the economy, including $500 million in export revenue. It employs about 136,000 Victorians. 85,000 of those are employed in design roles and a further 50,000 in design-related support roles, so it really is big business. We educate more university-trained designers than any other state in Australia, and we host the largest share of international design students with a 30% share of the national total. More than just economic returns, design brings many social and cultural benefits too, and it's these three pillars that Creative Victoria seeks to promote and to strengthen. Melbourne Design Week is one of our key initiatives, and it's wonderful to see how the program, led by the National Gallery of Victoria in collaboration with many partners, has grown in just 3 years. In fact, the week is so action-packed, as Don said, it's spread across 11 days. And not only is it just going for longer than a week, it's also extending beyond Melbourne too. This year, for the first time, we're presenting a special program in Geelong, which as many of you will know, has been recently designated as a UNESCO City of Design, owing to its extensive design heritage and growing contemporary design community. Design Week aims to explore the value of good design and the wide-ranging effects design has on contemporary life. This year's program encompasses some 200 events, all centred around the theme Design Experiments. How can design shape the future? In many ways, tonight's discussion gets to the heart of the theme. Dr. Christian Bason is a leading proponent for the application of design across all industry sectors. He's the CEO of the Danish Design Centre, a government organisation that promotes design services to businesses and to industry. He's the former director of the Danish government's innovation unit, Mind Lab, which was a cross-government organisation established to help the Danish government work with the community to tackle wicked problems. In the early 2000s, I had the opportunity to visit Mind Lab and the Danish Design Centre, and this provided plenty of food for thought and inspiration for the development of Victoria's first design strategy, which I was working on at the time. Since those days, Christian has become an in-demand speaker globally on the ways design thinking can drive public policy and enhance social innovation. And tonight, Christian will speak about the fascinating work he's led in Denmark to uncover the design DNA of the nation, to chart the scope of the design field and to map the value of design to the business sector. We'll reflect on how the mainstreaming of design opens up new opportunities for designers and at what cost. And he'll address critics who feel that marrying design up with other industries will dilute the profession. Big questions, and Dr. Christian Bason is ideally placed to answer them. We're in for an informative and inspiring evening ahead, and I hope it sparks many more conversations about the role design plays in our state, our community, and in our lives. Please welcome Dr. Christian Bason.
Thank you so much, and thanks for spending part of the evening here. I know coming from Denmark, where the weather is about 5 degrees centigrade, raining, and very windy, I'm surprised that more of you aren't outside right now. So I'll spend a bit of time sharing some perspectives on design, and I spoke with some colleagues earlier today about how when you come from something called the Danish Design Centre, first of all, you're expected to speak about Scandinavian furniture, and secondly, you're probably supposed to say that design is good. I won't speak so much about Danish designer furniture, even though I love it, and even I have one of the big manufacturers on the board of the centre. But I will reflect on how might design be good, or what is the potential of design in addressing the kinds of challenges we have today. So let's see. So it'll be a critical perspective, but it is also going to be a pretty optimistic perspective still. But let's start with the critical first. Things are changing. Things are changing rapidly. Technology is changing. Our populations are changing. Cultures are changing. Politics are changing. Actually, when I say turbulent, I would say the way in which we, you could say, design for society, or the way in which we run policy making has become increasingly difficult, not only in the United States or in the UK. Actually, our neighboring country, Sweden, they spent about 4 months even forming a government recently. I know you have an election coming up pretty soon, where that word maybe also be relevant. So we are seeing some challenges. We're also seeing a world that's complex, where problems and challenges don't easily go away. And I often argue that the language we use around addressing our problems in society is often out of tune with the nature of the problems. So, for example, we often, and I've done that myself, it's probably you can find it in some of my books, we say we need to solve poverty, or we have to solve homelessness, or we have to solve the climate thing. But the word solving isn't really that helpful, because that's a word from mathematics, it's a word from engineering, it's a word that we use to, as if we will eliminate the problem. But what we can hope for is not to eliminate any change in our climate, but probably to address it, to ameliorate it, to find ways of coping, find ways of doing better, or find ways of doing better with homelessness or poverty or health challenges. So there's something around understanding that the nature of the problems we're facing are complex, interdependent, wicked problems, and what consequences does it have. And I'd say if you want to argue for why is the term design thinking and so the rise of design for other applications than traditional industry, product design, graphic design, visual communications, why has that been rising over the last decade or more? Probably the reason, part of it is that we are looking currently, and I say we, I mean decision makers, developers, innovators, policymakers, even politicians, for other approaches, other tools, other ways of addressing the types of challenges we see. So what design is offering us in a way is a way to engage with the future that goes beyond analysis, goes beyond calculations, goes beyond more traditional ways of working both in business and government, and saying how can we bring in, well, we could say creativity, we could say imagination, we could say futures. Last weekend I was in South by Southwest, the conference in Austin, Texas. You could also call that a design week or a design festival. It's a big one. I think 800,000 people go through an entire event. And one of the things that struck me was that, and I've been coming the last few years, that this year science fiction was a big thing. Science fiction. And there were business leaders, I was in a panel with one, saying we need to have science fiction driven innovation, whatever that means. But there's this interest in looking to the far future, looking for more imagination. And I think that's not a coincidence. It might be a reaction to the kind of turbulence we're seeing and a need for imagining different and maybe sometimes better, sometimes also more dystopian futures, and using that as a driver for rethinking what we do today. So science fiction, just check it out and hold on to it, because it might become a thing. If you want to write something or publish something, maybe you should look to the science fiction field. So because of this, I think that design thinking became a thing. When I myself came into this field, some of the first things I actually was inspired by and reading and also reflecting on was really some of these books. And these are also some of the people who've been criticized for starting this wave of, you might say, diluting or bringing the design field into totally other areas of decision-making, for example. And the Harvard Business Review has been publishing extensively on design since. Actually, I was recently asked to write an article for them on design, or actually I invited myself to write the article. It's what you do. And what they did was they said, well, we've been writing a lot about design or design thinking. Why don't you take a look at what we've published the last 10 years on it and tell us what you're going to write that's new? Which meant I had to sit down and read every article published, digital or physical, from that magazine for the last decade and find out if I had anything new to contribute with. But one thing that struck me, and I'm just going to say this as part of the critique part of today, hardly anything published in Harvard Business Review, the most influential business magazine in the world, arguably, was research-based. It was more reading like very good advertising for the company IDEO, or very good advertising for Procter & Gamble, for the Rodman School of Business in Toronto, where Roger Martin is based, and pretty good advertising for the Stanford D School. But not necessarily something that was based on rigorous research about what is design thinking applied to business problems. So that was a bit surprising. But maybe it also shows that we're talking about an immature field still, and where we're talking about a field where academia, researchers have really maybe not moved into it in a mainstream way. And so there's been criticism. How many of you have seen this video to the left here with Natasha Jen? Heard about it? I'm not sure how we are with swear words here in Australia, so I won't say the entire thing, but the title of her talk is something like, design thinking is B, and then ... and ends with a T. You should watch it. Because Natasha is a trained designer, and she does a talk at a conference, video filmed, a bit like a TED talk, and she's basically saying there's nothing there. But she's also saying, interestingly, that there has been writings about design thinking for a long time. And maybe part of the problem is we're not looking to history and looking back and seeing what's actually been done before. Roberto Vaganti, a good relation of mine, has written a very interesting book on a critique, basically, of user-driven innovation, human-centered design, the idea that if you just study people hard enough, you'll come up with better ideas. And he's actually, in this book, Overcrowded, making an argument to go back to design as the practice of giving loving gifts to people, of giving users, consumers, citizens, whoever you're designing for, something that you love. And that users, consumers, customers can sense if there's no love in what you do. There's no love embedded in the design. It's a very nice and very passionate, very Italian argument, and a respectful critique of this user-driven paradigm. But it really isn't that new, design thinking. The idea to unpack and untap how do designers and architects work in action, what are the ways in which you can think through doing. And so I would say that that's an important part of our field, part of your field, and that I think there's a potential in looking into what does design practice, what is that like in the world now and in the future. So I would say that just remember that maybe there's been some very popular books and magazine articles, but actually we are looking into a body of knowledge that goes at least back to the 60s, if not before. And right here's the article that then came out of my having to read all those articles. And my co-advisor, Robert Austin, and myself, this is based on a PhD research I did on how public managers can work with designers primarily. And we wanted to use a different title than design thinking, but we couldn't. In fact, the Harvard Business Review insisted that design thinking is what we call things these days. So if you want to publish, that's what we do. And I guess we caved. So maybe, and for us the important part was to get the message out of what are the leadership practices we need to deploy to bring the best of what designers, professional designers, can bring to organizations, and then we can go along and call this design thinking if that's so important. So what we do at the Danish Design Center is that we say we work to empower companies, individuals, and public organizations to shape the next, to design the next. And what might the next be? Well, the next might very well be a product or a service, but the next might very well also be the next business model. If you're talking about, for example, going from a product-oriented company to a service-oriented company, the next digital business model, or when you look at government, it might be the next way of governing. And so we actually are just concerned with bringing the tools and the approaches and the mindsets of designers to organizations, quite often simply by pairing them with good design consultancies or individual designers, but also through capacity development and training and so on. We're based in Copenhagen, and we're funded partly by the Danish government. About 50% of our funding is from the state of Denmark, Bill of Finance, and we report to the Ministry of Business, which would be the Economic Development Department. And the rest of our funding is from all kinds of other sources. We're about 35 people. And when I became CEO 4 years ago, I made a decision that we should probably employ designers. Which I would say throughout history we have had designers before, but we really didn't have any at least not with a long like master's design education when I came. And another really crazy thing was I suggested that we would use design methodologies ourselves in how we work. It's a bit hard to get your head around because then we like promoting design, but using design to promote design. It's like a double thing. But that actually turned out to be harder than I thought, because after having led MindLab for 8 years and preaching and practicing sort of how can we bring design into public organizations, now I found myself running a public organization with a mandate to advance design and trying to deploy design methods in the work we did. It turned out to be not so easy, and to go from the past organization to the next one, but it was really an interesting learning journey. Now we're in this building. It's actually not a Danish architect who designed it. Anybody know who's the architect? Rem Koolhaas. So that's crazy. A Dutch architect designing for the waterfront in Copenhagen. And of course the building was not particularly well received when it opened up last year. But we're now in it, and it's actually turning out to be as a major hub for people in Denmark around architecture and design. We have the Danish Architecture Center in the building, Danish Design Center, and I would say even more importantly, really an innovation hub that works on how can we leverage design and architecture to address urban challenges at a global scale. Every day, 550 people go to work there. There's an innovation network of about 280 companies attached to the building. It's called Blocks, by the way, the building. So the innovation hub is called Blocks Hub. Very, very original. But it's turning out to be interesting because we have entrepreneurs, we have startups, we have designers and architects, we have public institutions like ours, all in the same ecosystem, working increasingly around sustainable development of our urban environment, nationally, but very much also globally. And then we're just 1 year in, but it's already now, it's beginning to be interesting. I'll share a few examples from some of our work there later. So we're there. This was when the paint was just drying. In what we call a design studio, again, practicing what we preach and trying to sort of create an environment that's attractive for people to work with. What we do is really to connect, we would say, the design resource, the skills and the tools and the capabilities of designers across Denmark and also internationally with the problems and challenges facing business and facing the public sector. And here comes the design part, in my mind at least. The way we try to do that is through experimentation. It is through trying out new approaches, designing programs that are very, very small scale, prototyping them, learning quickly, and then beginning to look how can we share and how can we scale up, which is the exact opposite way where as government normally would run policy, because government organizations would normally spend a lot of time collecting data, a lot of time getting the research and the evidence right, then massaging decision-making, making decisions, and then rolling stuff out. And we try to practice the opposite, basically starting with small-scale interventions and then learning from that, which turns out to be a tough one to also convince government. Unfortunately, the way we're funded means we can actually take small amounts of money and do small-scale experiments without having to do too much proof to start with. So we work on futures, we work on trying to explore what's going on in the future, we work on training and leadership development through design in partnership with Copenhagen Business School, with Oxford Business School and others. We work on transformation programs that really have got to do with shifting organizations from where they are today to somewhere else, both public and private. I'll get back to a couple of the programs later. We do branding activities, and part of the reason I can say that it's extremely legitimate for me to be here, apart from the generous invite, is that yes, I am here also to share what we're doing, and that's part of my job on behalf of our country. And finally, we do policy, which means we work with creative industries, policies, we work to influence government and being good advisors to government on design policy, and in a broader sense, innovation policy. Also for innovation and service innovation in the public sector. We had to choose some areas to work with, so we've decided to work, of course, with business and startups as two very important areas, but also in health. Every time, at least I walk into a hospital, it's almost like I take on my anthropological cap and begin to look at what could be changed and be better. And there's always room for improvement in healthcare. It's such a difficult, technologically challenged area. It's an area with so much human emotion, so much at stake, that we'll have to get better. And in Denmark, our healthcare system is under massive pressure in terms of efficiency, in terms of cutting costs. So finding better ways of becoming more human-centered, while at the same time becoming more productive, is you could say, the design challenge. Cities is important for us, not least because of the ecosystem we're part of with Blocks, the building, but also because creating livable cities, human cities, cities that can both innovate and create business environments that are attractive, but also cities that are just good to live in, is a global challenge. And one of the crazy things we're doing right now is to look not, by the way, at cities, but at rural environments and saying, what about the 50% of the world's population that do not live in cities? How do we design with and for them? Over the last years, I've written a few books on innovation. I even brought some Danish ones just so you see that we also do stuff in the Danish context too. This one is called Shape the Future, Form Fremtiden. But most recently, this one called Leading Public Design, and they're based on my research as well. So, is design splintering, or is design just expanding? Now, this sort of embracing design thinking and embracing design at many different scales and applications. There's certainly, critique going on. These are a couple of company names. Some of you can recognize. And what these companies have in common, including Implement, which is the biggest Danish-based management consultancy, what they have in common is that they all have been purchasing design firms over the last 3 or 4 years. The other day I had the interesting experience of speaking with a consultant from McKinsey, and on the line was 2 people from McKinsey. One called himself from McKinsey, and the other one actually had a Swedish accent and was from Verde, which is a Swedish design consultancy. Now has been purchased, but still using that name. We're seeing large corporations invest massively in training and skilling people in design. Not only has Phil Gilbert, who leads the design practice in IBM, in a way he's like revitalizing IBM as a design company. He's recruited a lot of designers, but that's not the full story. The story is he's also conducted training programs for 160,000 people at IBM. And most recently, about a year ago, 2.5 years ago, IBM started doing consulting in design thinking, in whatever their brand of design thinking might be. But something that has become a service line for them. And it's become a major sort of capability inside the company. Other companies like SAP and Philips and others are doing the same. Part of it almost sounds like marketing or branding. McKinsey buys itself a top design firm. It's like almost the most important part is just that they do it. You can wonder what they do with it. And I think the jury's still a little bit out on that one. But at least there's a marketing component. To the left is a very simple representation of some of the fields of design coming from a program called Design for Europe, which mapped design practices across Europe. There's also the recent report from McKinsey, which funnily enough coincided with the launch of a new company called McKinsey Design. And this, the business value of design is a quite rigorous analysis of the competitive edge that companies that are design-based have, and looking into how they outperform their peers with pretty strong indicators that firms that are design-based over a 3-year period actually have a 50% higher turnover than their competitors and a 30% higher return to shareholders. This is the kind of work that McKinsey does, and I would say that to some extent it's a good thing because it puts business value on design from someone who cannot be seen as necessarily design advocates. Of course, there can be a bit of a critique since they're using it to launch something themselves. Lots of focus also on design for the public sector, service design specifically. And one example is this report, which was even translated into Japanese by the global organization Service Design Network. This is in Danish, unfortunately, but we do, every 2 years, we do a survey based on the Danish Design Center's original methodology. We call it the Design Ladder, looking into sort of the design maturity of companies. And one interesting insight from this year's survey across a statistical representative sample of all companies in Denmark was that to a very high extent, design has suddenly become a CEO matter. Decision-making around design has moved into the C-suite, so to speak, to a higher extent than just 2 years ago. So there's certainly something going on. There's something about awareness that's happening. And for these CEOs, they are very well aware that design is not a beautiful chair. So something's happening. And this slide is my sort of attempt at summing all of it up. The worries to the one side and the opportunities to the other. That, yes, there is absolutely a risk we'll see design being diluted, becoming a brand thing, and becoming something you can throw around as management lingo. Yes, there's a risk that people will think of design only in monetary terms and business value rather than in all the cultural and aesthetic qualities of design for a society. and we will be reducing the value in a way. There's also the risk that we'll have happy amateurs entering a field where it can be difficult to assess what is quality and what is not. And we'll have a backlash against design, or whatever we call it, strategic design or design thinking or service design, because it doesn't work, or because it's not good, because it's not of high quality. That is absolutely a risk. And there's a risk that we lose the cultural and the art and the crafts and the aesthetics that are so fundamental and important to design practice. And we see something else emerging instead. But I do also think that the potential is there, that leaders, managers, or just people in development functions or in change functions and change roles will see that they need to empower designers, professionally trained, educated designers. That's at least what I tend to argue. And that also that designers can embrace and engage with organizations in different ways and empower and also challenge management. We run a program in Denmark where we've not only curated some of the best designers in the country, but we're looking into how can we develop a field we call design coaching, which is how a designer can be almost like a leadership coach for executives. And what's that relationship like? And we know throughout history some of those relationships have been some of the most productive and powerful in industry when a very skilled designer has been an intimate partnership with an executive. I'm sure you all know the examples from popular culture, but how does that actually look like, and could we make that into an explicit program is something we've been exploring. So we put the designers through an executive coaching course with a CEO, like a specialist in CEO coaching. So I won't spend much time on this, but just to say that we do have some global challenges. I mentioned them in the beginning. I think one global challenge we have, which we are quite concerned with in Denmark, is sort of technological lock-in and technological dependency. So that the vision for the future that we all presented with from especially large tech companies out of the United States and the Bay Area is as if that is going to be the future. And that there's only one trajectory. And of course the ultimate version of that one is the idea of the singularity, that there will be a point in time when machines are collectively smarter than us, and that'll be sort of the end point of societal development, where I think we as a society and societies have to challenge those assumptions and have to, in a sense, take a design lens to technology, a human lens, and ask ourselves, what kind of society do we want? What kind of life do we want? How can this technology be in the service of people? In Denmark, we have an annual, not a design festival, but we have that too, but we have an annual tech festival. And that tech festival actually has produced something we call the Copenhagen Letter. It's a manifesto for human-centered and humanity-centered technology. And this year we expect about 20,000 people to join for a few days in the meatpacking district in Copenhagen to celebrate humanity-centered technology. Denmark has also recently appointed a technology ambassador with a global mandate. So this is a diplomat with ambassador status whose role is to have conversations with tech companies about regulation and privacy and ethics and so on. I was with him in Austin, Texas last week, and I must say that he's actually becoming a more and more depressed person. So I was the optimist in our panel conversation. He was the pessimist. Because when you spend all your time with the tech giants trying to convince them that a small, tiny country like Denmark should have a voice in how they leverage technology that influences our everyday lives, and realizing that those big tech companies don't give a damn, then you do get depressed. So he's a bit on a challenging mission. There's also these, which I think is interesting, that we now have not only a clear graphical representation of some of the world's biggest challenges and goals that we agree on, but we also have a frame of reference to work on together across business and government and the civil society in a way that I think is unprecedented. In my 11-year-old daughter's classroom in school, there's a poster of the SDGs. At my job, there's a poster of the SDGs. At the small tech startup working on new technologies for construction industry, there's a poster of the SDGs. City of Copenhagen has an SDG strategy, of course. Danish Parliament has a parliamentary committee. And I recently worked with the United Nations Development Program. They also have a little bit of a take on the SDGs. They actually had created something they call signature solutions, they call it, which is their version of the SDGs, because now this has become so mainstream. If you want to differentiate yourself as a UN agency, you have to come up with something different, apparently. Signature solutions, just check it out. It's a UNDP thing. All right, so I'm going to spend the last time of my presentation sharing with you 5 ways, not the only ones, but 5 ways where we as a country and the Danish Design Center as an institution are working to leverage, you could say, the design resource. And sort of what are the things you can do? And I'll just kind of give you some insights on what we have been doing and what we are doing, where you can say that what we're trying to do is to leverage design as a capability for society, for the good of everyone. And can take very many different applications. So one is to understand what is your design DNA. So in Denmark, we say we are a design society, but we don't know what that means. In a sense, you can say that we can't see the forest for the trees. We've grown up in a country with well-designed and crafted furniture in our institutions in the public sector. We've grown up with increasingly well-functioning digital public administration. We've grown up in a country where, in Copenhagen now, more than 60% of commuters go by bicycle. We've come to take for granted clean water, more or less clean air. But where did that all come from, and what does it look like, and how is that actually a result of good design decisions, even though we may not have called it that? So we undertook a work together with the Danish Royal Academy of Design, with the Design Museum of Denmark, which also has a research function, and with the Design Council, which is about 60 people that are designers and design advocates, a bit of a think tank for design, and then the Design Center. And we spent quite a lot of time reviewing, interviewing, surveying designers, experts, looking back into history, and basically ultimately coming up to 10 characteristics. The problem with that is that 10 characteristics is too much to remember, and it's also too many to go through with you today. But they are online, and you can read more there, and we're working very hard now to create a whole sort of pack of information, also because we want everyone in Denmark to know, and we want our embassies to know, we want everyone to understand this, rather than say, well, this Danish design is something about that beautiful chair, which it also is, and is included in the study. But here are some of the characteristics, and many of them you'd say, well, that would probably be the same if you did this for Victoria from Australia. It would probably be some of the same characteristics if you went to Italy or the UK. But we do think that the combination of these 10 characteristics or values is probably, all in all, unique to our region in some ways. And I'll just give you a couple of examples from the work we've done. So one example on social is how to create environments that are humanly attractive. This is the harbor bath in Copenhagen, which could not have happened without a clean harbor, by the way. And Bjarke Engels designed then the open bath. Be My Eyes, which is a Danish-designed app for helping blind connect with people who are seeing. And so using the app, you can basically connect to a global community of people who are seeing and say, what do I see now? And you just show the image from your phone, and then somebody in the world will connect with you and say, what you're seeing now is this. So that's a small startup, and that's what you could call social design. This small flower designed by Olafur Eliasson, solar powered for developing countries. We have the airport. We have a circular model for designer clothes for infants, which is based on a subscription service where these clothes can be recycled, upcycled, for more than 20 families. Service design in the Danish Prison and Probation Agency in designing out violence in prisons and understanding what are the intimate interactions between prison guards and inmates. On designing one of the world's most comprehensive systems for recycling and labeling. And this was policy design at MindLab. Yeah, that was a crazy workshop we had, I think. Ministry of Business, backyard. Second is to make your design resource visible. We just heard there's some interesting statistics, and you're kind of tracking the numbers here in Victoria. But we asked the following question. When design is changing and people are calling themselves designers without having a formal design education, how do we find them? So last year we convinced the Nordic Council of Ministers to work with us to fund a study on mapping the Nordic design resource in all the Nordic countries, and we partnered with our colleagues in the Nordic design councils or centers. And we said to them, we have to look into design as an enabler across all industries. We cannot just look for the statistical codes of who are working in marketing, and who's working in visual communications, who's working in architecture. And by the way, we didn't include traditional architecture in this. We looked into designers from sort of visual and product design, industrial design, and so forth. So trying to sort of define the field. We, it wasn't really my idea, but they came up with a definition of design that was in some of my work. So this was the definition that the study used, which we put in a book a few years ago. So saying this is the kind of activity we're looking for. And we're looking for who's conducting this kind of activity. And we're looking for both formal and informal skills. So we said we're looking for individuals in the Nordic countries that have design competencies that are being brought into use or that could be brought into use. So even a designer who's trained but is working in a totally other industry, maybe not even using his or her design skills, will still be viewed as the design resource. So this is what we said. And of course the trick is you cannot find out about this through regular surveys, and you cannot find it in national statistics. So what we did was we partnered with companies that could look into websites and LinkedIn sites and scrape them and find what are self-designated skills from people across the Nordic countries, and looking into actually literally thousands of sites, using that as a supplement to surveys and also to statistics. And these are the numbers we came to. This is about 2% of the workforce in the Nordics, and pretty much the same. It varies a bit across countries, but about 2% of the workforce are either trained designers by profession or have acquired design skills. 2/3 are actually, this is 68% here, 32 there, so 68% are actually with a formal design education. And we ranked a number of educations as the ones we calculated, including borderline design engineers, digital design, so a pretty broad span, and of course art-based design education as well. And these are the industries by sector, and of course coming from the work I've been doing in government innovation, I'm thinking there's a huge market and a huge opportunity for designers to work with the public sector, because the public sector does not make up only 12% of the economy in the Nordics. Actually, the public sector makes up at least 30%. So designers are way underrepresented in government. These are some of the different types of results or orientations that the designers we surveyed and included in the study have. And you wouldn't be surprised to see that this is the main thing, but we're seeing this happening as well. And this is a lot of jobs, a lot of economic activity, and a lot of contributions to the economy. That's right there. By the way, I'm happy to share the slides, so also fine to photo them, but also I'll happy if you can provide them later. We're still struggling a little bit with the difference between product development and form giving of products, but the difference here is that product development is designers who are in design management functions and are responsible for product processes more than the specific shaping and making and form giving and industrial design. So these are the different divisions of the Nordics and also the divisions in Denmark. So here's a typology that was the best we can come up with, and we still call this a prototype, even though we spent quite a lot of money and time on it. But this is the first step we've had at it. I don't think it's ever been done before in the Nordics. Celebrate, I'll do this quickly. This is just about, we have to celebrate good design. Of course, we have to have design festivals, design weeks, have to have design awards. We're running ours in May this year again, and putting designers together with the Danish, I'm sorry, not the Crown Princess, unfortunately, but the Crown Prince, which is Mary's husband, who's celebrating with us there. We have Index Award, which is a global design award, the biggest one in the world for sustainable design. And that's actually where Crown Princess Mary is the protector, and she's usually there for those awards. They're running again this year. make policy. Of course, a country or a state or a region has to have some way of looking into what is the policy for design. This is an illustration from when we published recommendations that we need to bring. This is exactly the design as an enabler. I'm not sure I'm so happy with the image, but this is how can we bring creativity and design into all types of industries, all types of businesses. And this is the report came out with, it's called the new strategy proposal. It's the only proposal for a strategy. It's called an international growth environment for creative industries with a comprehensive set of more than 30 recommendations for government. And it might actually be completed, this strategy, before the upcoming elections. There's a bit of a scramble going on right now to actually write the strategy itself. So, of course, working on bringing in the design community and the creative communities to craft and build those types of policies is important. What I want to end by sharing is new combinations. Because what we try to do on an everyday basis at the Danish Design Center is to explore where could design be going. And I have this notion that maybe what we need to look into is Design Plus, which means taking the methodologies, the tools, and the practices and the mindsets of designers and bringing them into new combinations with other disciplines or other domains. Some that are obvious and some which might be less obvious. So let me share with you, based on some of the work we're doing, how one can combine design with some other approaches. Now, just to start with something quite easy, you could say, yes, of course, we need to bring design into the digital transformation going on in companies and in the public sector, bring in a human perspective, bring in services, bring in holistic perspectives. So we're working right now with some of the biggest Danish corporates on when they organize teams for digital transformation, typically internal labs and teams. How do we advance and accelerate good design practice there? These are some of the companies, interestingly enough, not just big firms, but also this one, HK, is the National Union for Office Workers. Now you would wonder, why would the National Union for Office Workers work on digital transformation and create an innovation lab? But they're a little bit concerned about automation and AI and machine learning if you're organizing 100,000 or a couple 100,000 office workers. So they were actually featured in The Economist, the international magazine, recently, because they're the first union known globally to have an actual innovation lab. But I think it's a pretty smart move if you want to think about the future for your members. This is quite obvious, enabling change. We're doing a project on helping 100 small and medium-sized enterprises go through digital transformation, where in Denmark, normally you would say, well, they just need to understand technology better, but we're saying we need to use design as the way in which you understand technology better, understand what that might mean for your market, for your customers, for your partners, and so on. Design plus startups, I think that's kind of emerging. I don't know that it's a big area right now, but what we did in Denmark was we acquired funding from the Innovation Fund of Denmark, and now we're running an incubator where young people out of university receive a grant, a monthly grant of a couple of, 3,000 Australian dollars. They receive pocket money for another 5,000, and then they receive really, really heavy mentoring and coaching, including the major part is in design practice. And these are startups from any field. It could be in healthcare, it could be in banking, insurance, anything, but where there's two phases of this program. It's a 12-month program, and we're incubating it right in blocks where we are. First is getting the problem right and challenging the assumptions about what's the customer problem or the market problem. And the second phase, the next 6 months, is to designing the thing right. So one is understanding the problem and the opportunity, and the next one is crafting and creating an experience or product that's really powerful. Here's an example of one of them. It's called Matter. It's actually just won a nomination for the Danish Design Awards, and they're creating a platform for sustainability in pensions and investing your pension funds basically into the SDGs. And how can you create a platform for that? That's an example. About 50% of all those startups are actually startups in the sustainable field. They're impact startups, basically. And not because we've designed it as an impact program, it just happened that way. Design and challenges. So Around the world, the idea of innovation challenges has been growing. You've heard about the X Prize and other things. And for a while now, we've been sort of exploring how can you bring design methodologies into that. To me personally, it started when Bloomberg Philanthropies, an American foundation, ran something called the Mayor's Challenge. The Mayor's Challenge still runs. It was about bringing innovation to city government around the world. And when they ran a Mayor's Challenge in Europe, I became part of the selection committee for that one. And when I was leading Mind Lab, we brought our team to help the different city teams use design thinking and service design to shape their ideas and craft them into something that was actually usable for citizens. So the idea became, could we do that in different contexts? Right now we're running an innovation challenge called the Circular Construction Challenge, Design Out Waste in the Built Environment, funded by the Danish major philanthropy Realdania. By the way, Realdania is also the philanthropy that funds blocks our building, or funded the construction of it. And here we have really made a global call. I had about 60 competitors, narrowed it down to 10, down to 6 through a long process of iteration. And now we found 3 winners. Each get 1 million Danish kroner to develop their idea. And now that's when the real design work starts. And we're running a number of design boot camps for them now to help them finalize their business ideas. And it's really important to use design because some of them are conglomerates of up to 19 different institutions going together to create systemic circular models, which means that just finding ways of collaborating around the problem is really, really tricky for them. This is kind of the design of the program. How do we find a global challenge like waste in construction industries globally? How can we address the needs of the built environment, but also the business needs? And how can we find new solutions? One of them is pretty wild. This is one of the winners. It's growing building materials out of fungi, out of good swamps, you could say, good organic material. And basically the idea as it's emerging now, and they're designing this right now, is to create a repository of recipes for how can you grow building materials out of something organic. Yeah? Doing any of that here in Australia yet? Well, I'm happy to connect you if you're interested. Design plus futures. So back to the science fiction part, how can we expand our conception of the longer time frames? How can we look further into the future in complex, difficult areas? We chose healthcare as an example. So these are 4 scenarios. I won't go into detail on them, but just to say we created a framework working with about 120 doctors, nurses, medical device manufacturers, policymakers, startups, technologists, to come up with radically different scenarios for the future of health. It could be in Denmark, but it could be elsewhere as well. This is also online. It's called Boxing Future Health, the program. And then creating future labs where you can experience what it might feel like to be in those futures. For example, this one is the scenario that we call Ministry of Root Causes. It's a scenario for the future where government knows everything about you and where it's going to feel like lying in pink, fluffy pillows and being taken care of by the state and by data and by algorithms and by AI. Question, of course, is that what we want? Is that the kind of future we would like? It turns out we're doing surveys we've had 2,000 people experience these scenarios by now into these parts we've created where they can experience the emotions, but also listen to voices of patients from the future, telling narratives, and then workshopping and working on what the implications might be. And it turns out that most people are actually pretty happy with that future scenario. And this is Denmark. We like the welfare state, and we like being taken care of. Design plus open. So how can we open up new business models? This is the Danish, do you know this company? Anyone? So it's a hi-fi, Bang & Olufsen, yes, a hi-fi manufacturer, but the product I'm talking about today is not this one, but this one. This is an open source piece of hardware that you can attach to any speaker, Bang & Olufsen or else, and immediately you have amplification, Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, and you can then upcycle your old, beautifully crafted 1970 speakers to sound and play exactly like a pair of brand new connected speakers. This is just an experiment. They call it BO Create as a sort of disruptive innovation practice within the company. but you can actually purchase the print board now. It's do-it-yourself, do-it-yourself. So the least aesthetic Bang & Olufsen product ever, but maybe one of the more innovative ones. OpenDesk, you probably know this company, the idea that you can download open source designs and locally manufacture them. We put all that into a program we call Remodel, which is an open source program for business, and where tools and toolkits for how can you go in 8 weeks through a process to create open business models was created. So this is also online as a free toolkit, also on GitHub. Design and governance. Even the World Economic Forum is talking about design as a way of approaching the world's governance problems between public and private. And these guys are UNDP, country office, Ukraine, working on open governance models for the United Nations in saying, how can we design a very different way of running the United Nations Development Program? Rather than running the program as an organization that does projects in countries, could we run the UNDP as an open platform, leveraging resources from not just governments, but business, startups, civil organizations. And this is one of the crazy ideas they have. What would happen if the UNDP partnered with other UN agencies to do what they're doing on the platform? How can you cut across silos in that kind of system? That's the one they may not get at, but they're trying. So, that was some of the things we're doing at the Danish Design Center, some of the things where I think that we can bring design into other domains and combinations that might be fruitful, might be interesting, might be valuable. The way we try to work is to, as we say, work out loud, to share what we're learning. We're using some taxpayer money, so we'll try to share it. So I'm happy to share any questions you might have. Before I do so, the last project is a new book I'm working on with a colleague. We call it Expand. And the question becomes, where could we go now? And just to give you a sense of some of the topics we're looking into in this new book is how do we design when the border between what is living and what is not living is changing because of digital technology? How do we design beyond for humans, and not just for humanity, but for planet? How do we design in a world where we are reconnecting with nature in different ways? How do we design at global scale? And how do we design at hyper-local scale? How do we design and expand our perspectives on designing for radically different time scales? So one of the case examples we're looking into is a small town in Norway called Treseder. And Treseder is a hamlet. And if you're a hamlet in Norway, you're prone for losing the entire population to the cities. Oslo, which is, I guess, the only city, really. And in Treseder, they're trying to break that tendency. And here's the quote from the project manager. They've brought in artists in residence in this small hamlet on a bay in a fjord in Norway. They have the coolest rock festival in Norway right now. And they're saying the following. There have been a human settlement in Treseder on this fjord in Norway for the last 9,000 years. What we're doing now is we're merely designing for the next 9,000. And that timescale might be what it takes to be really, really ambitious about change. Thanks for listening.
We've got just a few minutes or so, but Christian's willing to take any questions from the audience.
Absolutely. So I don't know if there are any mics, but I'm happy to take any questions.
Yeah, there's a couple of microphones we've got.
There's one question over here, right in the middle, so that needs a little bit of help to get the mic there.
G'day, Christian, and thank you for your presentation this evening. Actually, it's probably not a quick question. It's probably a really difficult and complicated question. But given that design likes wicked problems, maybe it's okay.
Let's try.
You mentioned sort of initially in your presentation the need to sort of redefine design away from sort of craft models and more into, say, a horizontal approach to, let's say, problem solving. Mm-hmm. Do you think perhaps maybe design's got a branding issue, and design as a term itself is sort of failing and letting itself down?
Yeah, so I do agree with that. That kind of is a challenge. I would say that, so give you an example. So in a few weeks from now, April 12th, we're celebrating our 40th anniversary at the Danish Design Center. And of course, we're not calling it the next 9,000 years, we're calling it the next 40 years. And I think one of the things we need to explore, so we're doing a big conference and inviting in the design community in Denmark and globally as well, at least some of our advisory board is global. I think we need to revisit craft and aesthetics in a digital age and be ambitious about that. I think we need to revisit ethics, privacy, security, and I do think that design has a role to play in that world. I think actually the most important piece, and maybe it did come through in my presentation, is that this is not an either or. That let's get rid of this sort of crafty, artsy, making and shaping things and physical artifacts, and let's move into thinking and methodologies and double diamond models and processes, so on. No, I think we have to work with design as problem solving and thinking and imagining on the one side, but also giving form and shape and texture and expression. And so I think, but of course that stretches design. That's why we call the book Expand, by the way. It's like we're stretching the concept maybe beyond its limits. But design has been with us in for at least 100 years or more. And human beings have engaged in designing since we could even, do anything with materials. So I think it's just a responsibility we have to take on and go forward into that and address it and deal with people saying that design is getting diluted. I think it's also a question of, it's also in a signifier that there's something to design that can help us. But yeah, we'll continue that conversation for a very long time, I think.
I think there's a question just a couple of rows back.
Yeah, back here.
Just
right there, yeah. Right behind you, yeah.
Thanks a lot for your presentation. It was really good. One of the things you mentioned is the difficulty in getting, I guess, the powers that be to buy in to a design process and also to pay for it. How do you guys address that?
So again, I mean, you can be critical about what McKinsey is doing, but I think if they're doing it, some CEOs are going to listen in different ways, and they're also going to consider design as something really expensive. I mean, I think measuring the value and the economic returns on good design, I mean, by that I mean good design, but also design capabilities, right, is one way of putting something, highlighting the value. But again, it can be reductionist, so I think we have to be a little bit nuanced there. And in fact, some of the work we're doing is we're not only measuring sort of the outcomes of our programs, we're measuring what changes in organizations. And sometimes we see, for example, massive changes in employee satisfaction or in different ways of engaging with partners. And yeah, maybe there's some profits there as well, but employee satisfaction and reduced sick leave and pride and so on is also really, really important. So I think there are ways in taking a more whole view of the value of design. And then I think there's important that we can speak to decision makers and leaders at a high level, understand their concerns. I mean, if you run a big corporation or you run a big public institution, you have many other concerns than design methodology and design process. You just want to address problems. And if you can demonstrate how designers' way of working and hiring designers into your teams and into your functions can be part of actually making you more successful, then they listen. But you have to speak their language. And that's part of the role that the Danish Design Center has had for 40 years. Actually, we were established by the design community to be sort of the executive arm of the design community to actually be able to move into those conversations. That's part of the role that the Design Center can play, I think.
Any more questions?
We have one maybe over here, actually.
Oh, sorry.
We have another mic coming around, so do that.
Right there.
Hi. So I actually went to Melbourne Uni and then ended up not studying what I studied because I discovered this thing called design, and I was like, wow, that's really what I wanted to do, but I never understood the term for it because I always thought it was about aesthetic and the craft, and I didn't study that. So it was always exclusionary. And I sort of felt like there was this ego about being the master architect and we're designing the world and we're doing all of these things.
Yeah.
How can we connect regular people? I say that with a, an asterisk. How can we connect regular people to design, and what is it about, is it the word design, is it the words that we're using, the way we're talking about it, is it excluding humanity, or is it excluding, are we talking up here, like design is everything that you don't understand, or should we be getting rid of the ego?
So when I was a management consultant a long time ago, we were commissioned to do a study of the labor market for designers in Denmark, or for architects in Denmark. And again, in Denmark, we kind of distinguishing a little bit between architects, planners on the one side, and industrial designers and service designers on the other side. And I remember actually experiencing a little bit of that ego question really going on, and in a sense it still is. I think one of the things that I've come to learn, and that can go for architects and planners, go for policymakers and others, is that it's really, really hard to design from the perspective of the people who are going to be affected by your work, right? For example, I'm learning that it's a very new thing a whole new thing in architecture to begin to be concerned with what are buildings like to work in, right? It's a whole new discipline. It's like, the building does things to people, so let's find out what it does to people and use that to learn how to design the next building. So I think there's a need for some humility, a need to be able to work at different scales. One you could say is outside in. It's taking your aesthetic and craft and your professionalism to do the large-scale structures and concepts. But what is it like that's where service design to me is really powerful, because what's a day in the life like in that building? What's it going to be for a regular worker, or what's it going to be? Let me give you an example. Maybe we'll close on this one depending on the time. But at MindLab, we hosted a really good Danish architecture firm, and they designed a hospice. And it was beautifully crafted hospice for end-of-life care. And the architects were discussing how, showing the model from bird's eye view, and then saying this is where the nurses are going to be, and this is where their workplace will be, and they're going to have great light coming in, all of that. All from a bird's eye view of the model, and they were talking a little bit about, the people who are going to work in the building. And at the end of the session, I thought to myself, I wonder what would have happened if they considered what it's going to be like to die in the building. Because there was no consideration of the people this actually is for. And there's no consideration of what will be a day in the life, or a few weeks in the life, or what will be the experience, the connectivity, what it'll be like how can they have relatives visit. And again, these designers were not bad people, and I'm actually pretty sure it was going to be an okay experience, but I just wonder how they could forget about it. And so I think there's, and this goes for planners, policymakers, business leaders, how do we put ourselves in a methodological way, a systematic way, an explicit way, into the context and the lives of the people we actually are here to serve. And what we're seeing in Denmark, for example, is that some of the biggest architecture firms are building design teams that are sort of a human-centered and service design-oriented, and bring that perspective in. And maybe that's part of what we could do, yeah?
Okay, last question.
You manage the time. So
just a quick question. Number 4 in your 5 points things was about make policy. I'm just wondering what you think of the role of the government is in this whole process.
Yeah, so again, coming from Denmark, but I have dual citizenship also of the United States, so I'm aware of there are different models of government, and in some the government is more involved than others. I think that government makes massive decisions for society. Massive, the most important ones we have. Governments invest massively in society, or decide on investments, even though they might be private, they still decide on them. So you could say that the ultimate role of government is to shape and make the environments in which we live, regulatory environments. Look at your built environment, it's all determined by regulation, ultimately. So having good design policy for how government itself conducts what it does, but also how government connects with and invites in other parts of society, and policy, which is about stimulating and supporting and investing in education and research and design skills in society, I think is really important. Of course, there are other policy areas that are also really, really important: healthcare, social services, education, and so on. But I do think a society and a government does need to be reflected about the role of design, because either you can not do it, you'll be making design decisions anyway. They'll just be worse decisions, less informed, less reflected. If you do make a design policy, or in a broader sense a creative industries policy, which I think can be a bit challenging because then you mix things a lot together, it's still about being reflected and aware and conscious of what you're doing. And it's a powerful lens, not the only one, but it's a lens to see through what you're doing. So I would advocate for that. I would advocate it certainly at a state level, in a federal construction like Australia or the US or Canada. It can be maybe a bit more difficult. But again, remember, in the US, for example, there have been huge investments going into culture and the arts, also from the federal government. So you kind of wonder, why wouldn't that also have a design policy? All right?
Thank you. Can you please help me in thanking the Treseder Fellow for 2019, Christian Bason, and his presentation
thanks for making it possible.
Today. Thank you very much.